Xi Jinping, as you know, has been handed over a third term as not just the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, but also the President of China, and this is unprecedented. Why is it unprecedented? Because in China there was a norm that the head of the state cannot have more than 2 terms. Each term was of 5 years, which meant a total of 10 years is what a head could serve. But in 2018, because Xi Jinping knew that he was well in power and he had the Politburo, which is a very, very important bureau of the committee in China, which rules China, well oiled, he pushed through a reform, an amendment where he scrapped this rule where a person had to just restrict the tenure to 2 years. In fact, he's put no tenure restriction now, and therefore for unlimited period of time a leader can rule the country. And that is what Xi Jinping was planning, because he's also drafted out a 2035 China plan. So this is where things stand as far as China is concerned in terms of the leadership, that Xi Jinping is here to stay. Now, considering that he's at the helm of affairs, how does it actually roll out for India and what does it mean for India? The fact is that Xi Jinping is very different from his predecessors. Person like maybe a Deng Xiaoping, who used to keep a low profile and continue to build China. In fact, Xi Jinping is now being compared to somebody completely different, and for different reasons. He's being compared to Chairman Mao, which means that's the kind of overarching influence that he has now built. And he's definitely more aggressive, he's more pushy. He also is somebody who likes to assert a lot of influence, including on neighbors, and adopt aggressive tactics. As we have seen over the last few years, there's been aggression all across the border, from Kashmir to Ladakh to the entire Arunachal Pradesh, where there have been constant incursions, and there have been some very nasty fights like the Galwan Valley fight. And I might add here that Xi Jinping made it a point to put the Galwan Valley point out in the National Congress, the 20th National Congress, which elected him, because he got the video of Galwan Valley played out in the National Congress, which is very, very unique sort of a thing to do. It meant that he was sending out a message that China is proud of its aggression against India. And he not only did that, he also invited the Galwan Valley commander, who was not of the same seniority or rank of the people who've been called at the National Congress. His name is Chin Fabao, and he had been called to this National Congress as a symbolic thing that he was the head of the Galwan expedition against India. So they actually celebrated aggression against India during the National Congress, which is a point that one really has to note. Besides that, Xi Jinping has also promoted 3 generals who are in the Western Theatre Command, which is right next to India. So he's promoted those people who've been actually pushing into Indian territory and have been absolutely engaging in confrontations, border confrontations and conflicts. So Xi Jinping has been promoting them. So that's another point that India needs to note as far as Xi Jinping's border policy or the LSE policy is concerned. Besides that, Xi Jinping is also thinking of expanding in maritime areas, and he's put out a policy where not only do they exert influence in the South China Sea, where, as you know, there was this confrontation against with Taiwan, when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of US, actually flew in for a brief visit, and China actually encircled it very ferociously, trying to prove a point that they are in control of high seas. But not only the South China Sea, China is also looking at a far sea policy. What is the far sea policy? It is where the ocean is not exactly touching the Chinese territory. It's a little further off, like the Indian Ocean. But they're putting out their vessels there all across, and as we know, they like to encircle India through militarily, also through the ocean means. So that is another area where Xi Jinping will continue his aggressive stance. when we are looking at maybe Bangladesh or a Sri Lanka or a Maldives or even Nepal, China has been buying influence by pumping in dollars, by pumping in money for infrastructure projects in these countries, and also giving them bailouts and credit lines like it did to Sri Lanka. In fact, the Sri Lankan economic crisis, which is very, very recent, where they didn't even have enough money to buy fuel for a few weeks, then come down to that sort of a situation, is because they have so much debt exposure to so many countries, including China, which actually owns about 20% of the entire Sri Lankan debt, which is a huge amount. And they've also been building ports for Sri Lanka, which Sri Lanka has not been able to actually pay back, and therefore China takes control of those ports and lets its military vessels come and start docking there, anchoring in areas which are just too close for India's comforts. And despite India doing a pushback, also pumping in money into Sri Lanka, extending credit lines to Sri Lanka, and despite protests by India to Sri Lanka about Chinese influence in areas and in ports in Sri Lanka, not much has been done, and China continues these tactics of actually coming closer and closer to India through these neighborhood routes. Now, Pakistan, of course, is another issue completely, and we need to tackle it completely differently, because Pakistan and China have been in bed for a very, very long time, for years altogether. And the fact of the matter is that China and Pakistan have been backing each other all the time in all international fora, particularly against India. And whenever India has wanted certain terrorists of Jaish-e-Mohammed or Lashkar-e-Toiba to be designated as international terrorists, China has vetoed that move as a permanent member of the Security Council, much to the chagrin of India, but one can't really help it. It has also been building a BRI, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, in Pakistan, right from its northernmost border right to Gwadar Port through Balochistan, which I personally feel is not a good thing for Pakistan. But the fact of the matter is that China is doing it, and I don't think Pakistan will ever be able to pay back for it, and therefore it will also mean that China gains geographical in depth within Pakistan and influence within Pakistan by stationing its people through this route, which will also be very, very close to India, and also will help a lot of its spy agents and the like. So this is how Xi Jinping has been extending very aggressive tactics all across the world, including with Europe, where it's been also unveiling its BRI. It's been a heads-on conflict in trade and trade conflicts with America. And with Xi Jinping's third tenure, not only should India expect this neighborhood policy or this aggressive border tactics and naval influence to continue, one should also now examine in terms of what is it going to mean for China itself. The fact of the matter is, Xi Jinping has bought this influence within his country as well, because he's understood how to influence the Politburo, which is the all and end all of the class and community which runs the country. And they have been backing Xi Jinping despite the fact that China is not doing that well economically. It had a 5% plus economic target, which they've not met. And in fact, the second quarter, they actually put out an official figure of 0.4% growth rate, which is far off from the 5% plus growth rate that they've been hoping for. And if the official figure is 0.4%, you never know, it actually might be, for all practical purposes, actually be a contraction. It might have actually, the correct official figure might actually be a negative. Not only is this economic challenge going to be a major one for Xi Jinping to have to tackle, Xi Jinping has also been running China with an iron fist and a lot of dictatorial policies, despite them not being very popular. For example, the zero tolerance COVID policy, where would you believe it, if you were to go to a school or a college or a government building or a government office or a public space, you cannot actually go without having a test done every 72 hours. So every 72 hours of your life, you have to get a COVID test. That is something which is completely, it's skewed in terms of the kind of zero tolerance policy that he's unveiled, but he has enforced it, and people are actually getting those tests done. So as they say in Chinese proverb, may you see interesting times, and it's not necessarily spoken always in the positive sense. In fact, when you say the interesting times, you think that there will be a lot of tumult. We have seen that the last 10 years with China have been uncomfortable for India and a lot of the world. With China and with Xi Jinping now getting this mandate, which is open-ended, one really doesn't know how it will, but one does think and can guess, or at least conjecture, that they will be interesting times.